So this brings us to what you call the political crisis of America. And you say the actual system of government conceived by the framers no longer pertains. What pertains?
I am expressing in the book, in a sense, what many of us sense, even if many of us don't really want to confront the implications. The Congress, especially with regard to matters related to national security policy, has thrust power and authority to the executive branch. We have created an imperial presidency. The Congress no longer is able to articulate a vision of what is the common good. The Congress exists primarily to ensure the re-election of members of Congress. As the imperial presidency has accrued power, the imperial presidency, surrounding the imperial presidency, has come to be this group of institutions called the national security state. CIA, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Office of the Secretary of Defense, the other intelligence agencies. Now, these have grown since the end of World War II into this mammoth enterprise. But the national security state doesn't work. The national security state was not able to identify the 9/11 conspiracy, was not able to deflect the attackers on 9/11. The national security state was not able to plan intelligently for the Iraq War, even if you think that the Iraq War was necessary. We're not able to put together an intelligent, workable plan for that war. National security state has not been able to provide the resources necessary to fight this so-called global war on terror. So as the Congress has moved to the margins, as the president has moved to the center of our politics, the presidency itself has come to be, I think, less effective. The system is broken.
Yeah, you say no one knows what they're doing, including the president. No one in Washington, you say. That's the political crisis, as you define it. No one in Washington knows what they're doing.
What I mean specifically is this. The end of the Cold War coincided almost precisely with the first Persian Gulf War of 1990-1991, Operation Desert Storm. Operation Desert Storm was perceived to be this great, historic, never-before-seen victory. It really wasn't.
The mother of all battles,
right.
Schwarzkopf counts.
Politically and strategically, the outcome of that war was far more ambiguous than people appreciated at the time. But nonetheless, the war itself was advertised as this great success, demonstrating that a new American way of war had been developed, and that this new American way of war held the promise of enabling the United States to exercise military dominion on a global basis in ways that the world had never seen. The people in the Pentagon developed a phrase to describe this. They called it full spectrum dominance, meaning the United States was going to exercise dominance, not just capability, dominance across the full spectrum of warfare. And this became the center of the way that the military advertised its capabilities in the 1990s. That was fraud. That was fraudulent. To claim that the United States military could demonstrate that kind of dominance flew in the face of all of history, and in many respects set us up for how the Bush administration was going to respond to 9/11. Because if you believed that the United States military was utterly unstoppable, then it became kind of plausible to imagine that the appropriate response to 9/11 was to embark upon this global war to transform the greater Middle East. Had the generals been more cognizant of the history of war and of the nature of war, then they might have been in a better position to argue to Mr. Rumsfeld, then the Secretary of Defense, or to the President himself, be careful. Don't plunge ahead. Recognize that force has utility, but that utility is actually quite limited. Recognize that when we go to war, almost inevitably, there are going to be unanticipated consequences, and they're not going to be happy ones. Above all, recognize that when you go to war, it's unlikely there's going to be a neat, tidy solution. It's far more likely that the bill that the nation is going to pay in lives and in dollars is going to be a monumental one. My problem with the generals is that, with certain exceptions, the famous General Shinseki, with certain exceptions...
Who said, we are going to need 500,000 men if we go into Iraq, and
right.
He was shown the door for telling the truth.
By and large, the generals did not speak truth to power.
One of the things that comes through in your book is that great truths are contained in small absurdities. And you use the lowly IED, the improvised explosive device or roadside bomb that's taken such a toll of American forces in Iraq, to get at a very powerful truth. Tell me about that.
Well, wars are competitions. The adversary develops capabilities, your enemy develops capabilities, and you try to develop your own capabilities to check what he can do to you to be able to overcome his capabilities. One of the striking things about the Iraq War, in which we have been fighting against, technologically at least, a relatively backward or primitive adversary, one of the interesting things is they have innovated far more adeptly and quickly than we have.
The insurgents.
The insurgents have. And an example of that is the IED, which began as a very low-tech kind of primitive mine, and over time became ever more sophisticated, ever more lethal, ever more difficult to detect, ever more difficult to check. And those enhancements in insurgent IED capability continually kept ahead of our ability to innovate and catch up.
I think you say in your book that it cost the price of a pizza to make a roadside bomb?
That's right, yeah.
This is what our men and women are up against in Afghanistan as
right,
well?
And the point is to say that the reality of war is always a heck of a lot more complicated than you might imagine the day before the war begins. And rather than looking to technology to define the future of warfare, we ought to really look at military history.
And what do we learn when we look to the past?
What we should learn from history is that preventive war doesn't work. The Iraq War didn't work. And therefore, we should abandon notions such as the Bush doctrine of preventive war. We should return to the just war tradition, which sees force as something that is only used as a last resort, which sees war as something that is justifiable for defensive purposes.
How then do we fight what you acknowledge in the book is the perfectly real threat posed by violent Islamic extremism?
I think we need to see the threat for what it is. It is a real threat.